The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise in the House today to speak to C-7 and contribute to the debate on this bill. I'll start by echoing the thanks that other members have offered today to the men and women in the RCMP and for the service that they do for the country. What better way to thank them, Madam Speaker, than to grant them a long overdue right to be able to bargain collectively with their employer. One that unfortunately it took the Supreme Court to weigh in on in order for them to be granted, but nevertheless we've come to a place where we can now recognize that right. I think that's a good thing for the country, and we in the NDP are concerned to make this bill the best that it can be and to honour that right to bargain collectively to the maximum possible extent. This is an issue that became more personal for me, or personalized at least, because it actually came up while I was canvassing during the last election. I knocked on the door of an RCMP member who lives in my riding and, asked what I thought about this. And of course, intellectually, I've been on the side of labor and workers' rights all my life. But, this was a guy who was working for the RCMP who was frustrated about things that were happening in his workplace that he thought could be going better. Didn't feel that there were meaningful avenues for RCMP members to complain within the organization that would really be heard, because he felt that ultimately management controlled all of those processes and felt that collective bargaining was the way to start getting those concerns addressed. What was interesting is that although he mentioned pay and benefits, a lot of the concerns that were raised, or I certainly got the impression that first and foremost what he was looking for, and he felt many of his fellow members were looking for in collective bargaining, was the ability to address workplace safety and health issues, some of which had to do, say for instance, we hear from some RCMP members with harassment within the force. For others, it's staffing ratios and how many officers are responding to a call, particularly in remote and northern communities, and what that means for the safety of RCMP members who do respond to those calls and are responding to calls alone. So that impression that I got that day is echoed actually by the Mounted Police Professional Association of Canada. What they've had to say about this bill so far is, quote, "Unfortunately, the way it stands, this bill is flawed by removing vital matters from the bargaining table, such as disciplinary measures and allocation of resources." So I take from that, Madam Speaker, that the conversation I had during the election with that particular RCMP member who lives in my riding was representative of at least some, and perhaps many, the views of many RCMP members across the country, some of whom have already organized within a voluntary association, to say that what they really want to be able to weigh in on at the bargaining table, aside from pay and benefits, is the conditions in which they work and the threats to their safety that sometimes arise because of decisions made by management about who will be responding to what calls and in what way. I think it would be a mistake for the government not to see this as an opportunity, not just to try and minimally satisfy the requirements of the Supreme Court decision, but to see it as an opportunity to create a meaningful mechanism by which RCMP members who have the experience on the ground, who are getting to see firsthand the way in which policies designed by management are playing out for individual officers across the country. A meaningful mechanism for those people with that expertise to weigh in on those kinds of decisions. And of course, the Supreme Court ruling was quite clear, and I think we all know in this chamber that simply being able to discuss something at the bargaining table is no guarantee that any particular conclusion is going to be drawn or that management won't maintain its prerogative with respect to a particular issue. I think as we talk about collective bargaining and what should and shouldn't be included under the purview of bargaining, it's helpful to refer to some of what is said within the Supreme Court decision about bargaining and what its intent is and why it matters. So I'm going to quote at length, Madam Speaker, from that decision. "As social beings, our freedom to act with others is a primary condition of community life, human progress, and civilized society. Through association, individuals have been able to participate in determining and controlling the immediate circumstances of their lives and the rules, mores, and principles which govern the communities in which they live. Freedom of association is most essential in those circumstances where the individual is liable to be prejudiced by the actions of some larger and more powerful entity, like the government or an employer. In this case, both, Madam Speaker. Association has always been the means through which political, cultural, and racial minorities, religious groups, and workers have sought to attain their purposes and fulfill their aspirations. It has enabled those who would otherwise be vulnerable and ineffective to meet on more equal terms the power and strength of those with whom their interests interact and perhaps conflict. And that, I think, Madam Speaker, is what we're hearing from RCMP members, is a strong feeling that the means at their disposal to address issues in their workplace are ineffective. And we hear the sense of frustration that comes with feeling vulnerable and not having a fair process through which to challenge a person or an entity much more powerful than oneself. And I would say that no small part of what RCMP members sought to achieve through this litigation process that ultimately terminated in the Supreme Court ruling that they do have a right to collective bargaining was the freedom to pursue their goals within the workplace. And we know that some of those goals, some of the most important goals, really are about workplace safety and health and less about pay and benefits, Madam Speaker. The Supreme Court recognized in its decision that this ability is what makes collective bargaining important. So they said, for instance, a process of collective bargaining will not be meaningful if it denies employees the power to pursue their goals. The balance necessary to ensure the meaningful pursuit of workplace goals can be disrupted in many ways, Madam Speaker. Laws and regulations, for instance. This is the Supreme Court saying this, Madam Speaker, that laws and regulations may restrict the subjects that can be discussed or impose arbitrary outcomes. And of course, I think that's certainly what we're seeing with respect to some issues in this bill, is that a law, in this case C-7, is going to restrict the freedom of RCMP members to be able to pursue their goals within collective bargaining. And that's why we in the NDP find some of the exclusions so concerning, because the Supreme Court has rightly said that what makes collective bargaining important is the freedom for employees to be able to pursue their own goals that they determine within the workplace. We've all heard stories about RCMP members responding to calls alone in remote or northern communities and the threat to their safety and security that poses and some of the debates around that. We've heard stories recently in the news about persistent allegations of sexual harassment and the powerlessness that some RCMP members feel in being able to raise those complaints. So I can understand why it is that they'd like to be able to weigh in on those issues and feel that a process that puts them at the table as an equal partner in negotiating the way that these issues are going to be dealt with is the way that they feel that that's best done. That yet another regime where the government, along with the commissioner, decide how those things are going to be decided may, in the opinion of some members, not be adequate. Certainly, given that collective bargaining has been prohibited in one way, shape, or form in the RCMP since 1918, there has been lots of opportunities for government-led or commissioner-led solutions to address these kinds of persistent problems within the RCMP, and yet we deal with them today. We have a new government now that's going to try in their own way to deal with those things. Our modest proposal, Madam Speaker, is that perhaps the time has come to let employees in at the ground level, at the table as an equal in being able to bargain about how some of these issues are going to be dealt with. Of course, that doesn't guarantee any particular outcome. It doesn't mean that the employees are going to be successful at the table. It's just to say that it makes sense to let them raise those issues at the bargaining table if they see them as important issues, and we know from some members that they do. All we're saying is, why not let them raise those issues at the table and make a determination then, based on a concrete proposal, whether or not what they're saying makes sense, whether it's consistent with what we've heard is the unique nature of the RCMP as a national police force. Let that be decided once the proposals are on the table, instead of prejudging the issue and saying that any proposal that the members of the RCMP could possibly come up with are somehow not going to be true to the unique nature of the RCMP as a national police force. I submit to you, Madam Speaker, that many members of the RCMP, frankly most if not all, understand the nature of the workplace that they work in, are just as committed to the RCMP as a national police force, are just as committed to the important role that the RCMP plays within Canada, and are interested to advance solutions that will be in the interest, yes, of themselves, but also the RCMP, which I don't think need be seen as mutually exclusive. So that's what we're proposing, Madam Speaker, is simply that some of these exclusions don't make a lot of sense. Or if they do, we haven't yet heard why they do. We've heard some arguments about timeliness, that we're in a rush to get the bill through because we only have until May 16th. I submit to you, Madam Speaker, that's not a real reason. I think that's something that reasonable people can deal with, either by simply omitting those exclusions, or if that's legislatively complex because of some of the frameworks that are already in place, simply putting a timeline on when agreements made may supersede whatever is currently in place legislatively. And these are things I think that can be worked out at committee. I'm hopeful that the government will listen and that we might be able to reduce the amount of exclusions that are in this bill through the committee stage, Madam Speaker, which is why we'll be voting to send this bill to committee. Not because it's perfect, but because we do need a bill that recognizes the right of RCMP members to bargain collectively, and we're anxious for the opportunity to submit proposals as to how we might improve this particular piece of legislation. The Supreme Court also said, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, that that limits can be imposed on collective bargaining reasonably, and this was something that my Conservative colleague was alluding to earlier. They say Section 1 of the Charter permits Parliament to enact laws that limit Charter rights if it establishes that the limits are reasonable and demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. This requires that the objective of the measure be pressing and substantial, and that the means by which the objective is furthered be proportionate, i.e., that the means are rationally connected to the law's objective, minimally impair the right, and are proportionate in effect. The government argued that the point of denying RCMP members the right to collective bargaining, and I mean the government at court, not in the House today, was to, quote, maintain and enhance public confidence in the neutrality, stability, and reliability of the RCMP by providing a police force that is independent and objective. It seems to me that similar arguments today, and I'll note that the Supreme Court found that argument unsatisfactory, more on that in a bit, but it seems to me that similar arguments are really what's underpinning the exclusions in C-7 of certain matters from the bargaining process. While denying collective bargaining altogether is not the same as excluding certain matters from bargaining, I think it's worth considering the Court's response to the government's argument in court. The Court said in response, "It's not apparent how an exclusion from a statutorily protected collective bargaining process ensures neutrality, stability, or even reliability of the force. The exclusion of RCMP members from the Federal Public Service collective bargaining regime fostered, rather than inhibited, dissatisfaction and unrest within the RCMP. Furthermore, it's not established that permitting meaningful collective bargaining for RCMP members will disrupt the stability of the police force or affect the public's perception of its neutrality. The government offered no persuasive evidence to that effect. Empirical research tends to show the opposite, as does provincial experience with unionized police forces." And I would put to the House today, Madam Speaker, that the same is true, mutatis mutandis, of the exclusions to bargaining contained in C-7. So those were, arguments having to do with not giving them the right to bargain collectively at all. But I think we could say that a similar test really needs to be applied to each exclusion. It's not clear to me that there's any great purpose served by excluding some important issues from the bargaining process. And that's really what I'd like to hear from the government with respect to these exclusions. So in what way would including, say, staffing ratios in the collective bargaining regime, again, without guaranteeing any particular outcome, that employees would even bring a proposal about staffing guidelines, or if they did, that it would be successful in the process, how does excluding that make the RCMP more reliable, more neutral, more stable? We just haven't heard the argument for really the necessity of these things. We heard a vague comment earlier from the parliamentary secretary to the president of the Treasury Board that, there are certain things that have just always been within the purview of the of the Commissioner, and there's a managerial prerogative there. I would say that that begs the question, Madam Speaker. What's at issue is what will be under the managerial prerogative. So I think that's all well and good, perhaps if we were making the argument in court where the law was established, but as legislators within the House, it will be for us to decide what is within the purview of management's prerogative, and that's what we're contesting here today, Madam Speaker. So I think we have a pretty good test coming out of the Supreme Court decision. It's the same test that would apply to whether RCMP members should have the right to bargain collectively overall. We apply to each exclusion and ask for arguments and evidence to the effect that there's something that would jeopardize the RCMP as an institution if these things were submitted to bargaining. I think that's a hard case to make, Madam Speaker, and I think it's particularly hard to make in light of the fact that this legislation doesn't provide a right to strike. So disagreements go to binding arbitration. And the arbitrator is instructed to take into account in their deliberations the unique role of the RCMP as a national police force. So if proposals were put on the table by RCMP members at bargaining, I think it's clear through C-7 that whatever couldn't be resolved, presumably because RCMP management felt that those proposals were unreasonable, would go to an arbitrator who would have as part of their mandate to consider whether those proposals respect the unique role of the RCMP as a national police force, and I think by implication also whether any of those proposals would somehow be a threat to the stability, to the neutrality, or the reliability of the RCMP as a national police force. So I think that the RCMP's mandate and unique role, the term we're using here, is well protected within that process, and that these exclusions seem to me, in the absence of further argument from the government, although I'll stress again that I don't think we've really been given anything that would count as an argument for any of these specific exclusions. I think that role of the RCMP is quite well protected by this legislation, and so the exclusions are redundant. As I say, I'm hopeful that these are things that can be corrected at bargaining. I think that would help, or not at bargaining, rather, at committee. And I think if we do that, we'll end up with a proposal that can better reflect the desire of the RCMP members that have been vocal on this case. And I think that's what we should be striving for. I think minimally meeting the conditions of the Supreme Court decision is really not enough. I think we have an opportunity here to respect the spirit of what collective bargaining should be, and I think we have a mechanism already in the bill, which is not the exclusions, of ensuring that the unique role that the RCMP plays as a national police force is respected, and that there's a way to have it respected within that process by the arbitrator, Madam Speaker. So, as I say, I mean, this is something why, these are the reasons why we feel it should go to committee, where it can be better explored. We'll be looking for those arguments from government on specific exclusions, and in the absence of those, we'll be presenting proposals to improve this legislation and make sure that RCMP members get the right to bargain collectively, both in spirit as well as in letter, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much.